I've been thinking recently about the books that changed my life, and when I started thinking about it, my mind immediately turned to two authors, Kazuo Ishiguro and Philip Pullman. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized that these authors and their books have not changed my life. I immediately thought of Kazuo Ishiguro because he's my favorite author. Although maybe I've replaced him with R.F. Kuang, I'm not entirely sure. But in my opinion, Kazuo Ishiguro is one of the best living authors. He's created some of the finest works of art in the world of literature that have ever existed, and I don't know where I'd be without him in my life. And then I thought of Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials because, well, Northern Lights was the first novel that I ever read and truly fell in love with. It was the first novel that I ever read for pleasure, not in school. I've talked about this before. I was 15 years old and a friend of mine said, "Read this. It's incredible." And I did. I'd never been given a book recommendation in my life. My parents didn't read, and I only ever read what I was told to read for school. Some of it I liked, and some of it I didn't care about. Suddenly, someone thrust into my hands a really wonderful young adult fantasy book. Not only that, but it's a book that's very critical of organized religion, and I was a very punk, anti-theistic teenager. So for that reason, Northern Lights and the entire trilogy has stayed with me as something incredibly special. Did it change my life, though? Yes, but something wasn't sitting right. And I think it's because this book changed the trajectory of my life. And when it comes to the works of Kazuo Ishiguro, I don't know where I'd be without them. They gave my life so much color and so much beauty. I'm so grateful to these authors for giving me the wonderful fiction that they gave me. And I do think, yeah, this did change my life, because if I hadn't read it, I would not be anything like the person I am today. I wouldn't have become a high school English teacher. I wouldn't have started this channel. There is so much about my life, past and present, that was defined by me reading Northern Lights. So yes, this book did have a profound effect on my life and changed the trajectory of it forever. But as I continued to ponder over what it means for a book to change your life, I realized that aside from Northern Lights, most of the books that have changed my life have not been the ones I would have expected. See, anyone who's followed this channel for any amount of time will know that I mostly read and mostly talk about fiction. So as I continued to ponder the question, I kept thinking about the fiction that has most left an indelible mark on my soul. Wuthering Heights, for example. Wuthering Heights introduced me to Gothic fiction. And not only that, more importantly than that, it's a book that got me to rethink morality in fiction. The fact that so often people can fundamentally misunderstand a book. The fact that you don't have to have any likable people, any traditional heroes for a book to be compelling. In fact, that is pretty much the central thesis of Gothic fiction. Wuthering Heights is challenging. It is difficult. A lot of people don't like it because they don't understand what it is. But I did. When I read it, I fully understood what it was doing, and in that way, it felt like it kind of rewired my understanding of fiction as a whole. Then I started thinking about the novels that have left a profound impact on me in terms of the themes that they've explored or the ideas that they've brought to the surface. And I think this is probably the case for a lot of people, but no genre has me thinking and feeling the way that science fiction does. There have been a handful of sci-fi novels that I have read in my life, including this one here, that have filled me with a sense of awe that you just don't get from other genres of fiction. Sci-fi is so inspiring. It is captivating. It presents us with massive moral questions. And In Ascension by Martin McInnes is easily one of the most beautiful science fiction novels I have ever read. I cherish this copy. But in the past, there have been a lot of sci-fi novels that have done that. Most notably, Arthur C. Clarke's 2001 A Space Odyssey, the film of which I didn't see until fairly recently. But I read the novel very early on in my reading journey, and it cemented a love for what science fiction can do, the impact it can have on the human brain and the human heart. But even so, as I continued to ruminate on these things, I still wasn't happy with where I was at in terms of what books have actually changed my life. Then I realized I was not looking in the right place. I wasn't happy with the definition of changed my life. And I'm not saying this is true for everyone. I'm sure a lot of people are going to disagree in the comments and have hot takes about everything I'm saying here. But I realized that the books that have changed my life have been the nonfiction that I've read. Because so many of them have felt like they fundamentally shifted my brain chemistry. There have been a handful of nonfiction books that I have read which have entirely changed my relationship to the world around me. My perspective on things like religion, politics, economics, international relations, culture and history, etc., etc. The nonfiction books that have really left an impact on me have truly changed my entire relationship to the world in which I live. And that's what I mean here. The books that have changed my life have given me an entirely new perspective. They have pulled a lever and shifted the tracks that I'm moving down. Because we are all moving forward all the time with the passage of time. And occasionally a book comes along that completely shifts the path that you're on. And so in that way, by that definition, these are the books that have actually changed my life. Humankind by Dutch historian Rutger Bregman. I was lucky enough to briefly meet Rutger Bregman many years ago when he was doing a UK book tour to promote his first book, Utopia for Realists, which is basically an argument for universal basic income, looking at history, economics, politics, etc. Then he came out with this, a history of the human race from the perspective of kindness. There have been a lot of very cynical history books talking about the bloody history of our race. The most famous of which is probably Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, which I read, and it's a bummer. But Rutger Bregman had an entirely different perspective to offer, and I am still flabbergasted by this book. It is the kind of book that I will randomly quote or draw from when in conversation with friends out in the world. For example, early in the book, Bregman mentions how ridiculous it is that we often reference William Golding's Lord of the Flies when talking about the primal nature of humanity. The fact that we're all capable of so much violence and bloodshed. Put us on an island for a few days and we'll turn into criminals and murderers. And Bregman mentions the fact that we seem to forget how Lord of the Flies is fiction. It's not real. And William Golding was an abusive alcoholic. So Bregman started to wonder if anything like Lord of the Flies had ever actually happened. And it did. Not only that, it happened around the same time that Lord of the Flies was written. A group of Australian schoolboys got stranded on an island off the coast of Australia. They were there for 6 months, not just a handful of days. They built a fire and they kept it lit the entire time for 6 months, and they even kept up their routines, like saying their prayers every morning. Literally, Lord of the Flies actually happened. It was peaceful, it was organized, it was sensible, it was an inspiring story. But we all talk about the novel where things went badly because it's more interesting. Bregman talks about that as well. So many of the darker, more bloody narratives are the ones that stick with us because we like exciting stories. We reference the novel Lord of the Flies rather than the actual Lord of the Flies thing that happened but wasn't that interesting because Lord of the Flies is more exciting. But it paints a dark and macabre image of humanity. And honestly, I could quote and reference this entire book if I'm not careful. That is just like the opening chapter. He talks about the Stanford Prison Experiment, which has been debunked like 5 times. The Stanford Prison Experiment is a classic example of the fact that we are always minutes away from being violent, not just violent, but oppressive and cruel to each other. But it wasn't real. It was completely debunked. The experiment was faked. And Bregman talks about that in here. In Humankind, Rutger Bregman gives us so many examples of how often kindness wins. Kindness dominates. He talks about genetics, not just of humans, but of other mammal species as well. Early in the book, he talks about the fact that we're all pack animals. We are genetically predisposed towards kindness. Because we are a community-based species. We rely on one another. We are good to one another because it helps us survive and stay safe. We are not isolated creatures. We are not predisposed towards violence. But the narrative so often paints us as that. I could go on and on and on, and I don't want to. I just want to make sure that as many people as possible read Humankind, because this book rewired my brain. It had me realizing so many obvious truths about humanity, both in terms of our biology and our lived culture and experiences. People are good. But I'm sure some people are thinking right now, what about all the terrible leaders out there? Did you know that a tiny percentage of people could accurately be diagnosed as psychopaths? And so many psychopaths go towards positions of power. So it's very likely that so many of the CEOs and conservative politicians out there are actual genuine psychopaths who take themselves on a direct path to leadership and power. And all the rest of us, the vast, vast majority of people, are not that. Those of us who don't want to be conservative politicians and CEOs become decent, ordinary people. People who might be swayed by propaganda, yeah, but that's not the point. Most of us, the vast majority of us are so good and kind, or at least have the propensity, the capacity for kindness. But unfortunately, we live in a system that does not reward kindness, and in fact, makes life more difficult for those of us who choose to be kind. What is that system? What am I talking about? Capitalism. Which brings me to another book that fundamentally changed my entire brain. This is Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. I only read this book like a year ago, but it is one of the most captivating, inspiring, and influential things I have ever read. Federici's nonfiction book is an exploration of the past 500 years of Western society. And as we explore that 500-ish years, we look at the rise of capitalism, born out of the dead husk of feudalism. But in the book, she is specifically looking at capitalism through a lens of feminism. Pretty much the entire thesis statement of this book is examining and criticizing the ways in which capitalist societies have exploited the labor, the bodies, the minds, the time of women. Capitalism and patriarchy combined are the reason that women are miserable. The reason that women's bodies have been exploited. The reason that reinforcing gender binaries is so vital to the narrative of capitalism and conservative politics in general. This is a mind-blowing book in so many ways. I highlighted so many things, and I could pick any one of them to just blow your mind with. It's really, really remarkable. But unlike Humankind, I don't really need to sell you on this book because this is really, really famous. Caliban and the Witch is like 30 years old at this point, so chances are much higher that you've read or at least heard of this than you have of Humankind. But both of these books completely changed my perspective on the entire world around me. Obviously, going into this, I was already anti-capitalist, I was already a feminist, so it didn't entirely change my political and social perspectives, but it did give me so much to work off. It kind of solidified so many things that I already knew to be true. You know sometimes how you have a political opinion, and if someone pressed you on it, you might kind of stress out trying to explain yourself when all you really want to say is be good, be kind, treat people fairly, human rights, etc., etc. This is the kind of book that you pull out, and there are so many historical, economic, and political examples that you can pull out of this book to reinforce your point when it comes to being anti-capitalist, when it comes to being a good feminist, when it comes to just generally being a good left-wing person. This is a flawless book that I wish so many conservative people would read. And when I say conservative, I mean capital C conservative, but also people who are just kind of liberal, but maybe fiscally conservative, whatever. This is an extreme history book. It is so powerful, so exhilarating, and it will change your life. And before I get to the really big one, I do want to shout out a few other things. Like this blank little book here. This is a collection of the poems of Wilfred Owen. Now, I spend a lot of my free time writing and performing poetry. I've been published in a few places, and I wouldn't be a poet if it wasn't for Wilfred Owen. His poetry has always spoken to me in such a uniquely powerful way. I studied his poems when I was in school. I taught his poems when I was a teacher. I picked this book up in an old bookshop somewhere, and I love him so much. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low, drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. I love his poetry so much. Wilfred Owen was a British World War I poet. He was a gay man, and he died right at the end of the war. I can't remember exactly when, but it was like a week before the war ended. It is such a tragedy that he didn't see the end of the war. And I find his poetry so moving. I hate war. I am a pacifist. And it's his poetry that helped me get to that point. So poetry has changed my life, both as a reader and a writer of poetry. But nobody has affected me like Wilfred Owen. My favourite poem in the whole wide world is The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. And my favourite living poet is non-binary American poet Andrea Gibson. This collection, You Better Be Lightning, has inspired so much of my own poetry. They are incredible. But Wilfred Owen, time and time again, I return to Wilfred Owen. And of course, I have to mention Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka wrote fiction, but he also wrote a lot of letters and diaries, and I've read more or less everything he's ever written. Franz Kafka definitely did change my life. Because like a lot of the non-fiction that I've read, when I'm out in the world, when I'm thinking about our political and economic and social systems, I think about Franz Kafka in the same way that I think about a lot of the non-fiction that I've read. Kafka changed the way that I think about the world around me. He's also one of the few authors that I obsess over as a person. I know so much about Franz Kafka and who he was as a person. Franz Kafka was weird and interesting and unique, and I love reading about him. Without Kafka, I wouldn't have an interest in authors in a kind of academic sense. There's only a handful of authors whose lives I know this intimately. In fact, it's probably just him and Mary Shelley. I love this guy. I love his stories, and I love the way that understanding the Kafkaesque approach to story writing or to just observing the world around me has changed the way that I see the world around me. Kafka did so much for me, and I turn to his stories time and time again. He changed my life. Absolutely. And then there's the big one. The reason that I'm making this video at all. I was on a holiday recently and I saw a secondhand copy of a book I no longer own. Well, I do now. Again. This is Wild Swans by Young Chung. The reason that this book changed my life is very, very personal to me. I think a lot of the books I've mentioned here have the capacity to change a lot of lives, but this one is unique to me because I used to live in China. I spent 1 year living in Shanghai, and it was a very, very difficult year. As the years since leaving China have gone by, I have developed a lot of fondness for those memories. The places I went, the people that I met, the food that I ate, the things that I learned, yeah, it all seems so beautiful now. But at the time, my life living in Shanghai was really, really difficult. My work was stressful. My relationship was on the rocks. I moved out there with my ex. We both worked in the same place at the same company, and we both hated it. We fell out over and over again. By the end of that year, we hated each other and we broke up, and we got back together a few months later once we had both healed. But that year drove us apart. And it's really hard to admit, but one of the big problems for me was culture shock. I was 24 when I moved there. I was very young, very naive, very insensitive, and I was annoyed that Chinese culture, the modern Chinese way of living, wasn't compatible with the life that I had lived as a privileged white British person up until that point. So I kept getting annoyed at how busy things were and how quickly everybody moved and how nobody ever queued for anything, so it felt like everyone was just pushing in and being selfish. I made so many cruel and offensive statements and ideas, and it was bad. I didn't know anything about Chinese history or politics when I moved out there. I didn't know anything about politics at all. I didn't even know at the time who was the president of China or who the prime minister of the UK was. I was so desperately naive when I was 24, and I moved to China without reading any books about the culture, the history, the language, anything. And in so many ways, I wasted a year living in a place that I never appreciated. Then I read Wild Swans once I was home, and it changed everything. It immediately made me love and appreciate so much about Chinese history, Chinese culture. I appreciated the struggles, the pain that Chinese people went through for decades throughout the 20th century. The journey that China went on as a nation. After reading this book, I started reading Chinese fiction in translation. I started reading other books from other perspectives, all from Chinese voices. I built up a full understanding of Chinese art and culture that I should have had before I moved there. So now there is so much Chinese fiction that I love. I've been studying Mandarin on and off for years. I know so much about Chinese history, Chinese traditions, Chinese politics and economics. It's a place that I find endlessly interesting, fascinating, and a place that I really love and respect. And it all began with this book, Wild Swans. If I had read this book before I moved there, I would have stayed there longer. I would have explored more. I might never have come home. I don't know. But I did. And I sometimes think about going out to China again and living there for a little while. Or at least just traveling around and exploring. Blending the happy memories that I have of living in China with this book creates this lovely, blooming flower of appreciation for a wonderful place. And beyond all of that, beyond everything I've just said, this is very simply an incredibly powerful book about 3 generations of women living through 3 different eras of Chinese history, all within the 20th century. This book ends with a short biography of Young Chang herself, but spends the majority of the book exploring the life of her grandmother pre-Cultural Revolution, her mother during the Cultural Revolution, and the Cultural Revolution as a whole as it was unfolding from their perspectives. Oh my god, there is nothing in the world like this book. I love this thing so, so much. I cherish Wild Swans for what it taught me, for what it gave me, for what it did to me. I will forever be grateful to Young Chang and this incredible work of nonfiction. Those are the books that have changed my life. Some fiction, some poetry, but I was amazed by how much the few nonfiction books that I've ever truly loved have had such a profound impact on me, on my mind, on my outlook and perspective. I need to read more nonfiction. So give me some recommendations. Based on the books that I've just talked about, Caliban and the Witch, Humankind, Wild Swans, what other books on politics, economics, biographies, etc., history? I want to read way more history books about way more places. I have read a lot of history books about Japan. Bending Adversity by David Pilling is it Pilling? David Pilling, I think so. Bending Adversity. Oh my god, one of the most fascinating books on Japanese culture and modern history that I've ever read. So I've read a lot of books on Japan because I also used to live there and I've been a big weeb for a lot of my life. But other places, other cultures, other histories, give me your recommendations and subscribe for books.